From the nation's capital, the Conservative Caucus presents Conservative Roundtable, an in-depth look at today's most important issues.
Welcome to Conservative Roundtable. I'm Howard Phillips, chairman of the Conservative Caucus, which sponsors these broadcasts. It's our great privilege to have as our guest for this broadcast a man whom I've admired for many years, a real servant of the Lord, a real American patriot, Robert Knight. And he's done so much of which I am aware that I'm going to, lest I make mistakes, resort to the printed word. Robert heads the Culture and Media Institute at the Media Research Center. He used to be a news editor and writer for the Los Angeles Times, and he's been a media fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. He headed the Culture and Family Institute at Concerned Women for America, founded the Cultural Studies program at the Family Research Council, and held a fellowship at the Heritage Foundation. He was a key author of the very important Defense of Marriage Act, and he wrote a book called The Age of Consent, The Rise of Relativism, and the Corruption of Popular Culture. He's done many other things. His articles have appeared almost everywhere. He's been on almost every television show. He has a master's degree and a BS from American University. He lives in the D.C. area with his wife and children. Bob, recently you and I attended a conference at which our good friend Bill Lind said that if you transplanted someone from the 1950s into the current decade, that person would not recognize the America in which we now live and would not believe that this once great culturally conservative country has fallen so far so fast. And a key element of that precipitous decline has been the growth of the homosexual movement. We could talk about many things. We could talk about the evils of abortion and how it has come to be tolerated. We could talk about much, much more, but let's focus on the homosexual agenda. How have the homosexuals managed to take what was once commonly believed to be utterly shameful, an abomination in the sight of God? How have they made it socially and politically and culturally acceptable?
Well, first, they did what Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist, said to do, which was to capture the culture. And as an associate of his said, they needed to make the long march through the institutions, and that's what they've done. They have captured the media. They've captured the educational establishment. They've captured Hollywood. And they have promoted their message that there is no normalcy to sexuality, that anything goes, and that anyone who says otherwise is a hate-filled bigot. They've followed a game plan that is really quite impressive, given that they're less than 2% of the population. You'd never know it from all the characters on primetime television, from the emphasis in schools right down to the kindergarten level now in many districts, and to the constant news stories about their latest gambit. They have worked very closely with the abortion industry and with the pornography industry. I call it the Iron Triangle, because they all work alongside each other, because every one of their causes amounts to the same thing. It's an attack on God's plan for sexuality and the natural family. So that's why you see gay activists, and I just use the shorthand, but there's nothing gay about this at all. But you see those activists outside abortion clinics defending the clinic against those people praying outside to save the babies and spare the mothers the tragedy. And I always wondered about that. I thought, why would homosexuals who don't have kids or won't create kids defend abortion clinics? And it's because it's a common alliance of a challenge to God's order of sexuality. So it all makes sense. And the pornography industry, they've been behind that for a long time, supporting it. They're heavy users of it, typically, according to the surveys. And it keeps breaking down the idea that there ought to be restraint, innocence in children, modesty, chastity within marriage. All those things are under heavy attack in countless ways. And you can't blame just the homosexuals for the cultural sea change, but they're a key force in it.
Well, there are three figures in the history of the last 150 years: Karl Marx, Darwin, and Freud, who've had a big impact on this as well. The New York Times recently had an interesting article about the impact of Darwin on American politics and belief. And one can argue that if we are products of evolution rather than products of God's creation, if we're just pieces of meat, that we live for today, we live in the moment, and we don't worry about our eternal destiny. And the American Enterprise Institute had a debate recently between some folks from the Discovery Institute, which pushes intelligent design, and some so-called conservatives who talked about the supposedly good things that Darwinism had done in terms of, I don't know if you saw.
Are they libertarians or conservatives?
Yeah. Well, they call them, some of them were from National Review, and they call themselves conservative. Very interesting article. I was glad to see my old friend George Gilder taking on the Darwinists, and others were. But there's no question, Marx and Darwin and Freud have had a major impact in de-Christianizing American society.
Absolutely. And let me add a fourth figure to that. That would be Alfred Kinsey. It's no accident that he named his first volume in 1948, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male. Male, not men. He was following the Darwinian idea that we're all just animals, and we just vary a bit from our other counterparts in the mammal kingdom, but that we're really no different from monkeys, except we're just a little smarter, maybe. And Kinsey took the science and made it the excuse for every predilection under the sun, particularly his own. He was a flagrant homosexual himself, even though he was married and had kids. That was his main interest. He was probably a pedophile, although there isn't direct evidence.
Well, in elements of his research, there were some very questionable things that he arranged to have happen.
Yeah, kids being molested and then timed, and this being research on child sexuality. That research became the foundation for sex education in America and in other parts of the world, because it spun a new concept, which was child sexuality. And if children were sexually able and could enjoy it, why not give it to them? This was a direct attack on modesty, on the age of consent. Kinsey and his associates lobbied hard to reduce sexual law penalties against sexual predators, to lower the age of consent, and their cause was taken up by Planned Parenthood and other international organizations that push abortion. They're still working today with the Kinseyan ideology, which is that anything goes except the Judeo-Christian-based marital unit.
And of course, Kinsey was accepted as a legitimate authority. He was not challenged by organized Christianity or by the academic world or by the media until our friend Judith Reisman did a comprehensive analysis, an expose of what he really was and really stood for. And I know you've done things in that area too.
Yeah, but Judith was the pioneer. She wrote Kinsey, Sex and Fraud, and then she wrote Kinsey, Crimes and Consequences. And it unmasks not only the fraud in Kinsey's research, such as using convicted criminals as a major component and then saying it represented normal guys, using prostitutes and saying they were put down as married women if they lived with their pimps for a year or more because they were domiciled with them. That kind of nonsense. This is junk science. Judith shone a light on it, and we all ought to be grateful for her courage, because she was under fierce attack from the Playboy Foundation. That she was subject to ridicule and a smear campaign, but she's still holding strong, and we owe her a great debt. And her exposure of Kinsey really did open up questioning of the whole basis of the sexual revolution, because Hugh Hefner, the founder and publisher of Playboy magazine, based his beliefs on what he read in the Kinsey Report. And he was a straight-laced Methodist boy, apparently, engaged at the time, read the Kinsey book and had a revelation that, oh, I don't need to conform to a Christian view of sexuality. Sex is good in any form, and I'm going to push it. And he launched Playboy magazine in 1953, helped normalize pornography, which has broken down barriers. You know, think of pornography as the carpet bombing of a culture, because what it does is men get addicted to it, and it takes them off the moral battlefield. because they've got this guilty secret. And they don't want to be caught as hypocrites, so they stay out of any moral issues. I once ran into Dr. Dobson at a conference, Dr. James Dobson, and he had made a great presentation showing the damage that pornography does to families and men and women. And I said, well, if it's so bad and it's documented, why can't we stop this stuff? And he said, I'll tell you why. It's that stack of Playboys in a lot of men's closets.
In the barbershops.
And the barbershops. It's, yeah. He says it's like the sound of distant cannon coming after them. They may not get into the hardcore stuff, at least not initially, but they feel guilty enough to stay out of the whole issue. And then they adopt that libertarian view that, well, do what you will as long as it doesn't harm others. That, by the way, that's the credo of the Wiccans. And other
there are some heroes in this era. Phil Boris of Ohio has done a great job.
Yeah.
And he bravely confessed his prior addiction and has now become a major leader against the corruption of pornography.
Yeah, he cleaned up Cincinnati, and shut down all the sex shops.
He's had a tremendous impact.
Yeah.
He really is one of the heroes of the movement.
I agree. Phil's a wonderful guy, too. He's down to earth. He used to be a union organizer.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and he designs golf courses. I mean, he's a very interesting guy in addition to being a crusader against porn.
Well, we have to take a break. When we come back, I want to get very specific with you about some of the items on the homosexual activist agenda now. I want to talk about hate crimes legislation, which has been moving through Congress. I want to talk about ENDA, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. I want to talk about the fact that homosexual organizations are still, under this Republican president, as they were under Ronald Reagan, getting subsidies from the federal treasury. It's an outrage. Planned Parenthood is getting more money under George Bush than it received under Bill Clinton. Shouldn't be getting a penny of taxpayer dollars. Anyway, our guest is Bob Knight, who has a lot to say, who's done a lot. He's one of the heroes of our cause. Stay with us. We'll be right back after these messages. There are many conservative organizations, but the Conservative Caucus is unique in that our standard for evaluating public policy is the Constitution of the United States. Our goal is to advocate policies which conform to what the Constitution stipulates and to oppose those which undermine the Constitution. It's clear that the federal government has only those powers which are provided in the Constitution, which were initially delegated by the states to the federal government or which were subsequently added by amendment. If we adhered to that principle, your taxes would be lower and your liberties would be more secure.
The Conservative Caucus, www.conservativeusa.org or 703-938-9626.
Here's how you can become a citizen lobbyist and influence how your representatives vote. Write a letter to your congressmen and senators. Speak out on a call-in talk radio program. Write a letter to the editor of your local newspaper and call the Conservative Caucus for more information at 703-938-9626.
Come on, you're going to tell me that buying one imported towel is going to cost someone their job?
Ever tried shopping for clothes with a 4-year-old? I can't be looking for where the stuff is made.
Since 1980, nearly 500,000 Americans who make apparel and home fashions have lost their jobs, even though the quality of our products is second to none, which makes you wonder if it's foreign competition that's hurting us.
So the shirt's imported. Who's it going to hurt?
Or if it's us that's hurting us. Buy American, and Americans work.
Welcome back. I'm Howard Phillips, chairman of the Conservative Caucus, which sponsors Conservative Roundtable. And our distinguished guest is Robert Knight, one of America's leading warriors in the culture wars and one of the leading experts on elements of the culture wars. Bob, we've been talking about the way in which the homosexual agenda has been advanced. You know, I was at Harvard when Barney Frank was there, and he was supposed to graduate class of 61. I was class of 62. he was pulled out and put into a rehabilitation program, because in those days they thought homosexuality was a psychological disorder. Obviously, it didn't take with Barney, but he did graduate a year behind the rest of his class because of that. But attitudes toward homosexuality have changed. And I guess it's the American Psychiatric Association, which has had a lot to do with it. The homosexuals targeted that, and they challenged the idea that it was a disorder.
Well, they did very successfully. They took over the nomenclature committee. They threatened attendees at the National Convention that if they didn't get their way, they'd disrupt it. They basically bullied their way to a change in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Illness without any new research, because the only studies you hear about preceding that were from Evelyn Hooker in the 1950s, who set out to prove that homosexual men were identical and to heterosexual men, and she did 3 psychological studies, the Rorschach, the TATS test, and one other. And if you look at those studies, and we had to get them from the Library of Congress because they're no longer in print, it turns out that the homosexual men were quite different from the heterosexual men. They sexualized all the images. But this never came out in the media. She said, well, they're normal in some instances, so therefore there's no difference. The whole thing was utterly misportrayed.
You know, as a boy, I went to summer camp, an all-male summer camp, and I saw some of the campers manifest homosexual predispositions. And my impression was that in almost every case, they came from families with emasculated fathers, with weak fathers.
Or distant, or absent.
Who did not provide a strong role model example for the child. And in many cases, they had emasculating mothers who treated badly the children as well as the husband from a perspective that was cruel. And there are so many famous stories. Stephen Sondheim, who is a homosexual composer, talks about the way in which he was ill-treated by his mother, and his father was ill-treated, and he wound up being a protege of Oscar Hammerstein, and just so many others.
Yeah, there are striking similarities in many of these stories where the men didn't connect with their dads, never got a grip on what masculinity was all about, so they fell back into an identification with their mother. Because after all, the baby identifies with mom first, and a boy has to break away and identify with dad. Something else usually happens, too. Often, if the mother and father are having a bad relationship, the mother will turn to the son and try to get that emotional sustenance, and that's too much of a burden on the boy. Not only does he not have a solid role model as a man, he's got a woman who's smothering him with demands that he can't meet, so he begins to fear, while identifying with women, he begins to fear them, and he gets fascinated by masculinity. When that gets sexualized by someone taking advantage of it, that's when it becomes homosexuality. But before then, it's the kid trying to find out who he is. So it's sad, and the news that doesn't get out in the media is that people can overcome this temptation, as they can any other addiction or any other behavior that they don't want. It's tough for some of them because they get addicted to it over and over, and addictions are tough to break, but they can be broken, and that's the great secret the media don't want to tell people.
It may be just 2%, but to the degree that we see more open homosexual predispositions and even conduct on the part of males, one can attribute it to the movies, to television.
Oh, yeah, it's cool now.
To the schools.
Yeah.
But I would say that one can generalize into saying that a lot of it has to do with the feminization of our culture and the derogation of traditional masculinity. Strong fathers are no longer heroes on television or in the movies. Even Clint Eastwood, in his more recent movies, has departed from his strong male example to a kind of wimpiness.
Well, he wants to have strange new respect from Hollywood.
Yeah.
That's what you have to do. You have to toe the line. Have you seen the book Real Men by R. Court Kirkwood?
Court used to be my communications director. He's a magnificent man. My wife and I...
Great book.
Part-time homeschool 4 of our grandchildren, And I've been reading chapters from that book to my grandchildren.
Oh, that's great.
It's a great book. It's wonderful. Cord is a terrific guy.
He is. He's a good writer.
And he writes for Chronicles, which is one of the best magazines in America.
Right.
He also writes for the New American, and he's the editor of the major newspaper in Harrisonburg, Virginia. Cord Kirkwood,
busy guy.
He is a real man. He's a good man, and I appreciate his association. As a matter of fact, yesterday I gave a copy of his article about Virginia politics for the benefit of Senator Jim Webb, whom I'm trying to involve in our fight against the North American Union. And I think that Cord is extremely perceptive. I think his book, Real Men, is a very important book. And it should be on the bookshelf of every family. Boys should read this book.
I gave him a recommendation. I've got a blurb on the cover there.
It's a terrific, terrific book.
But before we run out of time, we ought to talk about the threat of hate crimes. There are two threats coming through Congress right now. The Employment Non-Discrimination Act, which would elevate sexual orientation to a civil right. It hasn't happened before in federal law, but this would do it.
Interesting. Let me interrupt. In the Republican debate, Tommy Thompson, former governor of Wisconsin, said, well, whether or not to hire or fire homosexuals should be left up to the employer. When the debate was over, he said, I made a mistake. Let me correct what I said.
Yeah, he couldn't stand the heat. He didn't answer it very well anyway. He got the right answer, but he stammered and looked like a deer caught in the headlights. The question was loaded. Should someone be fired just for being gay? That's a have you stopped beating your wife lately? The point is, should someone have special protections other employees don't get simply based on what they do in the bedroom? No.
Yeah, well, one of the basic principles...
And it's not like race or ethnicity that you can't
One of the
change.
basic principles of American liberty is freedom of association.
Right.
And that means that if you run a private business for good reasons or ill, you should be able to run that business in accord with your own preferences, your own beliefs. And it's not a matter where government ought to come in and tell you what you can and cannot do. But certainly when it's telling you to do something that's wrong.
Yeah, that's where we have to make the distinction.
Yeah.
The 1964 Civil Rights Act lists immutable characteristics like race and ethnicity and religion, which isn't immutable. But sexual behavior has a moral component. It's totally different from skin color. What you do sexually says a lot about your character, so your employer ought to be able to take it into account. The other dangerous bill is the hate crimes bill, sponsored by Representative John Conyers. This has been a long-held goal by Ted Kennedy. And that would introduce the concept of thought crime to America. The idea that you should be punished twice, once for the crime and once for your beliefs that may have triggered the crime. This is un-American. The law deals with actions, not beliefs and thoughts. Otherwise, we go down the road of totalitarianism, as we've seen in Europe. Under these hate crimes laws in Canada, Britain, Sweden, people have actually been jailed. They've lost jobs. It's going to happen here if we don't stop this thing.
And pastors are being censored for proclaiming the Word of God from the Bible.
Well, in Philadelphia, right here in America, 11 Christians were arrested under Pennsylvania's hate crimes law because they were preaching the gospel on a public street in Philadelphia at a gay festival. And the homosexual activists confronted them and caused a scuffle, and they arrested all the Christians, none of the people who actually caused the scuffle. And then they charged them with 8 counts, including 3 felonies, which would have added up to 45 years in prison, all based on Pennsylvania's hate crimes law. That's where we're going, and I think the bill is now in the U.S. Senate. It passed the House, with 25 Republicans voting for it, and almost all the Democrats. But it should be stopped in the Senate. This is a direct threat to freedom of speech, religion, association.
Of course, there have been so many bills that have already been passed of a pro-homosexual character. The Americans with Disabilities Act has elements to it that are outrageous.
Well, it's become the piggy bank for the gay rights movement because they get AIDS funding by the billions. We're spending, and a lot of it goes to education. And, of course, the educational efforts turn out to be safe sex and the promotion of homosexuality. They justify it saying, well, if people didn't feel so bad about this behavior, they probably wouldn't engage in risky behavior, which is, so let's push more of the behavior. It's oxymoronic, but that's really the reasoning the government bureaucrats give in shoveling the money.
We have to take another break. When we come back, we'll have just a minute or two with Bob Knight. And I'm going to, first of all, we'll tell you how you can get in touch with him and learn more about his work. But I'm going to ask him how he became involved in the culture wars. Stay with us. We'll be right back. There are many conservative organizations, but the Conservative Caucus is unique in that our standard for evaluating public policy is the Constitution of the United States. Our goal is to advocate policies which conform to what the Constitution stipulates and to oppose those which undermine the Constitution. It's clear that the federal government has only those powers which are provided in the Constitution, which were initially delegated by the states to the federal government or which were subsequently added by amendment. If we adhered to that principle, your taxes would be lower and your liberties would be more secure.
The Conservative Caucus, www.conservativeusa.org or 703-938-9626.
Welcome back. If you're interested in the kinds of issues we discuss on Conservative Roundtable, check out our website, www.conservativeusa.org for the Conservative Caucus. If you want to get in touch with Bob Knight, information about contacting him is on the screen. Bob, we have less than a minute. How did you get involved in all this?
Well, I became a conservative after I got out of college, and I began to work for newspapers, and over the years I started reading and seeing what conservatives had to say and realized that they loved this country and they were making sense, and I must be one of them. I became a Christian in 1986, and I was at the LA Times at the time as an editor, and that solidified my move rightward, and I became kind of a glass ceiling guy in the LA Times newsroom. So you think women have a glass ceiling? Try being a conservative in a major newsroom.
Or better yet, a Christian.
Or, well, when they found out I was a Christian, that was a double whammy. But anyway, it's been a good ride, and we're getting a lot done, I hope.
Thanks so much for spending this time with us. Thank you for watching Conservative Roundtable.